Welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is June 5th, a Wednesday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the House settlement and how some of that money might be split. There are some couple ideas that have been thrown out there over the last week and a half that I want to get into a little bit, and how Title IX might be just a little bit overlooked in this conversation. Then we'll get into a little bit of talk around Caden Proctor. It sounds like he fully regrets the decisions that he made with transferring to Iowa and then finding his way right back to Alabama. It sounds like he should have just stayed at Alabama, and he fully realizes that as well. So I want to get into that and why it's a really good thing for what the future of the portal holds for us. Then I want to get into playoff Cinderellas here for a minute. I think a lot of people are looking forward to seeing a group of 5 team make a deep run in the 12-team playoff. I'd be a little bit surprised if those were the Cinderellas that we ended up seeing. So I want to break down who I think the Cinderellas actually will be. Then we have an all-transfer team on the defensive side of the ball. We did the offense yesterday, so figured we'll follow up with the defense today before we finish it out with a Spotlight Wednesday. And we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked teams in the entire country, in my opinion, Oklahoma State. They're one of the teams that returns just so much ability and so much veteran leadership that they're going to be really hard to beat. I'll put it that way. But before we jump in here, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about this house settlement money, because that's the next big hurdle, right? We got over the big hurdle of just getting all of these court cases out in the open and dealing with them and getting them in the rearview mirror. Now, there's going to be more ahead, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but we now have at least what the number is for revenue sharing, which is $22 million per year. That is the top amount that you can do. Now, smaller schools obviously will likely do something under that because they can't much afford the $22 million. But there are different ways that people are thinking about possibly implementing that. And it's a very, very interesting conversation that a lot of people don't really know the rules to. And we'll get to that throughout this segment. But one of the big time questions is, where does this money go, and does it really hurt the non-revenue sports, the women's sports, some of the sports that maybe weren't talked about quite as much as they probably should have in these discussions? So the Baylor president, Linda Livingstone, had a very, very interesting comment where she said she was very optimistic that they didn't have to cut any sports, that they could absolutely make this work and not be, in a scenario where 5-10 years down the road, they start cutting off those Olympic sports where you would love for that not to happen, obviously. So that's obviously something that's great to hear from someone that is going to be in on these conversations. She seems very, very intent on making that work, and frankly, I think she's right. There is a path forward for all of this to work out, especially if you're going to keep collectives in on the party. You got to be able to split this thing evenly. And I fully understand that, you're going to want to push a lot of money in the direction of football and men's basketball and baseball and the revenue-making sports. There's no two ways about that. But with NIL, with some of the other revenue streams that these players have access to, we all know that the football players, the basketball players, the baseball players have more access to those than pretty much anyone else on campus, because they are the revenue sharing sports, because they are the ones that have a little bit more, juice around them, around those campuses. So those guys are going to benefit. There's no two ways about that. They're always going to get their NIL money. They're always going to have that ability to get that NIL money. The thing is, that doesn't necessarily apply to the swimmings of the world or softball or a million other sports. I'm blanking on smaller sports right now, but just in general, there's a way college athletics can move forward where this actually works, and it actually works better than what we had before, because I do think that with this $22 million, depending on, what that number looks like across the country, you can give a huge lump sum to some sports that have not had it in any way in the past. And I think even if you split this thing down the middle where $11 million goes to women's sports, $11 million goes to men's sports, you still have the ability to compensate the men's sports in NIL and scholarships and different things that kind of bridge that gap to keep you at a competitive advantage without maybe getting you into a little bit of trouble down the road, which is kind of the biggest question here, and something that I think a lot of people have been watching very, very closely, is the impact this will have on Title IX, because a lot of people are very confused. A lot of people don't really know what the rules are in terms of how this money can be allocated. And one of the things that I've seen, I believe Yahoo Sports was the one that reported this, and SEC presidents are not going to shy away from trying to get around Title IX in this kind of lawsuit. I mean, when you look at what the payments are going to do over the next 10 years, 90% of those are going to Power 5 schools. 90% of those in particular are going to college football and men's basketball players from the past. And that opens a little bit of a door, and the SEC is trying to run straight through it, because they are trying to allocate 80% to football, 10% to other men's sports, and then 10% left for women's sports. So they're essentially saying, if this money, the payout money that we are giving up, is going to these players anyway, why can't, on the back end, we give it to these players? So it's a very, very fascinating argument, and one that might be able to hold up. I don't really know how people are viewing this in these conversations. I don't really know how this is going to move forward, but I will say it is one of the big questions, and it is one of those things where you love to see all the conferences kind of on the same page going forward, because you don't want a scenario where, say, SEC has this rule where it's 80% going towards football, and the Georgia, Bama, Texas, all of those teams have the ability to just blow everyone else out of the water. And then you look over and you're at Ohio State, or even if you're at Kansas State or Utah in the Big 12, you want to compete with those guys. You want to be in those conversations, and you might just have to follow suit to do that. Now, the issue with that is not everyone has the ability to bridge that gap on the other side. As we just talked about, bridging the gap where if you were to split it 50-50 down the middle, you could get collectives and NIL and all of that different stuff involved for the men's sports really aggressively and bridge that gap. You can do the same thing on the women's side, where maybe you do give 80 or 90% of this money to men's sports, but give women's sports more scholarships, give women's sports a little bit more of NIL abilities and opportunities. But that does beg the question of, can everyone do that? And the answer is probably no. So the question really becomes, if Ohio State does this, if Georgia does this, if Alabama does this, if Texas or Texas A&M does this, it's not a problem. They have every ability to kind of split this money however they want and keep a lot of these sports intact, just in different facets, getting different money, whether it's scholarships or NIL or the revenue sharing. There's plenty of ways to keep all of these sports intact and kind of the way that we like them. Now, the question becomes, what happens if a UCLA gets in on that party and says, if they're giving 80% of their revenue to the football team, we probably should too, because we got to keep pace with these teams if we want to be competing at a very high level. Now, as we've talked about with UCLA, they're not exactly rolling in cash over there. They lost about $40 million in the athletic budget a year ago and have been in the red for the past, I think, 5 years. So it's not like everyone has the same ability to make all this work and kind of split this money however they want, but, figure it out on the back end with scholarships and NIL. Not everyone has that ability, and it's going to open a huge door. And I think one of the things that is going to happen, I feel very confident in this, if I'm being totally honest with you, is there's going to be a lawsuit. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know, where it's going to come from, but let's say the SEC is successful in putting in this model that they've kicked around, where 80% or 90% in general are going towards men's sports and 10% are going to women's sports. There's an argument to be made that they are violating Title IX. Now, the skirt around would be that 90% of this money would be going to men, in the back pay payments would be going to former men's athletes, but the reality is Title IX is a very, very ironclad thing, and it's something that has been huge in college sports for some time and has helped out not only women's sports but men's sports as well. So it'll be fascinating to watch what happens with Title IX going forward. It'll be fascinating to watch if, let's say, this SEC deal is passed through and a lot of the money is going towards the men's sports. there's going to be a women's athlete, someone that pops up and says, this isn't necessarily how this was supposed to go. And I think there will be a lawsuit on someone's hands down the road. Now, I don't necessarily know what that'll look like. I don't know who will be sued at the other end of it, but the reality is there's a lot of questions around how this money is going to be split up. I think a lot of us were a little bit worried about this kind of new step because it answered a big question in what is the compensation going to look like for college athletes, but it asked like 500 more questions during that time. And I think that's the big problem here is you introduce this new thing that pretty much has to be implemented by the end of the year almost, at least in the next 12 months. You have to have a really good idea of how you're going to split up this money, because if you don't, then you're already behind the eight ball. So all of this has to happen really quickly, and there's not really a good idea for what the rules are going into this. So a lot of this stuff is going to be ironed out in the future. A lot of this stuff, whether it's rules that apply to absolutely everyone, whether it's rules depending on your conference or depending on your school. I don't know how much autonomy some of these different entities will have in this conversation, but the reality is they need to know the rules. They need to know what can be allocated, because if it was up to them, I think a lot of this money would go towards football, but there needs to be some type of buffer between that, and not necessarily to say they can't spend that money, or at least the majority of that money, on the revenue sharing sport or on the revenue making sports, but they can absolutely split the pie a little bit more evenly than I think a lot of people want around the country. So once we get those rules in place, once we have an idea of Title IX is ironclad in this new agreement, and you have to, split this money evenly, or the opposite, Title IX can be skirted in this new world, and you have the ability to push a lot of money into football and basketball, but you might have to compensate it on the back end with scholarships and things of that nature. So there's a lot of questions, and I think one of the biggest things, the Kentucky president said this, where he just doesn't know the rules. He says, tell me the rules and I will live by them, but as of right now, we don't know the rules. And I think that's something that is a sentiment that I'm sure a lot of presidents and ADs and coaches feel around the country. So it gives you an idea of what this house settlement was. It was a lot about getting those cases kind of off the NCAA's table. It got rid of 3 of big-time antitrust cases that they absolutely needed off the books. Now, it creates a lot more questions down the road, and you have to figure out answers for that fairly quickly if you're athletic departments, if you're the NCAA in general. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think the powers that be have a lot of work to do to figure out how this is going to be implemented. Is Title IX upheld in this new ruling? And if it's not, how do we keep women's sports, afloat in this new kind of world? So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think it's one of those things that a lot of people around the country are biting their nails right about now, trying to figure out what the future holds for their sport. So it'll be really weird to watch. It'll be one of those things that we'll look back on in quite some time and figure out whether it was fair or not. But for the time being, we just need an answer. And I think we need it as soon as possible so people can start getting their ducks in a row and figuring out what this future looks like. But we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Caden Proctor a little bit. He is a guy that went through a very weird offseason. Let's just put it that way. Definitely had a lot of stuff that went into that, transferred to Iowa, transferred back to Bama. It sounds like he regrets that decision, and he regrets a number of decisions he made throughout this process. So I want to get into why that is and how it's a fantastic thing for the future of the transfer portal right after this. So stick with us.